So, picking up now on what the President has been saying, I'm joined again by our four historians remotely: Ewan O'Halpins in Dublin, Alvin Jackson in Edinburgh, Marie Coleman in Belfast, Niamh Gallagher in Cambridge. There are so many, and John Horn is still with us, and the President will join in as well. So many threads to pick up on all of this. Alvin Jackson, can I come to you first? I mean, partition itself has been mentioned in so many of the papers, and it's just a century old. Its centenary is coming up. How is that going to be commemorated? That's a challenge, because the Irish border is now back in the news with Brexit. It's suddenly something the British forgot about and didn't want to know about for so long, and now it's bang right on the table again.
Well, to state the obvious, there are ferocious challenges with the commemoration, the marking, the revisiting of partition in this its centenary year, and there are others within this conversation who will be as well placed as I to speak to this and who are involved with the administration of this in different ways. I think the essential difficulty, of course, is that the commemorative stimulus comes generally from the state, whether you're talking about the decade of centenaries in the south or this particular centenary in the north. And in the north, the nature of the state is and was ferociously contested. What is to be done in these circumstances? The state clearly has to have a role at some level. But that role, I think, needs to be carefully considered, perhaps in both jurisdictions. And I think the role might well be about encouraging more of a bottom-up approach to the reconsideration of events in the early 1920s than a top-down. And I think as well, we historians have got a part to play in all of this through the work that we undertake. But I think as well, there's the work of local history communities as well in the north, as well as across the island as a whole, who've got a contribution to make.
Marie Coleman, what's your opinion? You're among the advisors to the Northern Ireland office on this. Is it deeply contested? Is it controversial?
Well, yes, it is, in that there's one community which is just not engaging with it. But I think there's a wider community, not just of historians, I should say, but also the arts are quite involved in this and seen as somehow of a safer space for commemoration. And there's a sense among a lot of people that that one can park the question of whether or not one agrees with the establishment of Northern Ireland or not, and simply accept the fact that it is there and it was established 100 years ago. And if there are going to be commemorative events around it, then it is best to look at it in the proper historical context. There are moves similar to what Ewan spoke about in the South regarding the 1926 census to ensure that the fullest range of archival material is made available. So I think there's a wide sense of moving beyond one's view on it to accept it as a historical fact and reflect on it from that perspective.
Yeah, Niamh Gallagher, what's your opinion on this?
Yes, I mean, I agree with Alvin and Marie. I think our roles, myself and Marie, who are on the Historical Advisory Panel, is an independent role. And that independence of what it can do is crucial to the whole project. Yes, it was set up insofar as we were created by the British government, but in terms of what we ourselves decide to do in relation to helping to mark, to revisit, to think about the creation of the state, that comes down to us and to our expertise. And so I think what we're trying to do is to complicate a very hegemonic picture from one side or the other, to show a range of different experiences that happened, of course, from 1923 to 1922, but also over the last 100 years. It's about unfreezing these categories that President Higgins spoke about last time in his first talk in December. It's about opening up questions of agency, behaviour, attitudes to historical inquiry, and hopefully we're going to do a fair job on that.
That's not an easy job, though, to get each community. I mean, Northern Ireland particularly is a very special case where people tend to see their own history in a particular way. Are commemorations likely, in your view, to open minds rather than to leave people where they are?
Well, that's a really interesting question, John, and I think it touches on the differences between history and memory. So people have very strong senses of their own history, which often rely on selective narratives, selective versions of the past. And really it's up to them should they wish to think outside those confines. But in terms of what we are trying to do, we are trying to bring a more of a richness and a complexity to what actually happened to the public domain. We're not trying to be prescriptive. If people don't want to engage with a more holistic view of the past, I mean, that is up to them. But that's not what our role is. And our role is we are committed to the history, we are committed to thinking about experiences at the time, and we're committed to bringing those to a wider public.
Yeah, Ewan O'Halpin, what's your opinion?
Well, in relation to commemorating partition and the foundation of the Northern State, if I take them together, my view is that certainly in this jurisdiction, the state will do as little as possible and stay away as much as possible, and we will encourage, particularly in terms of partition and the border, encourage and facilitate local groups to do ideally on a cross-community basis, on a cross-border basis, and so on. In other words, I don't want to sound cynical, but I don't think anybody in government buildings wishes to anyway stir the pot. And I think that paradoxically, the virus especially, I mean, I was outside Mount Joy on the 1st November 2020, the anniversary of the centenary of Kevin Barrick's execution. Myself and my wife, the only people there because of the virus. And that probably, in some ways, prevented what might have been a scrum of different sort of commemorative groups. I do think in some ways that the virus may in the matter of occupying space and so on, and inflammatory or speeches and so on, the virus may help. But I do think the state here, it's very conscious that there are different perspectives and different takes, particularly along the border and so on, and doesn't wish to promote anything that's going to cause political upset to anyone, but is very willing to support local history societies and exercises like that, and cross-community especially. And the EU, of course, as well, has been funding a lot of cross-community activities generally and along the border. So I think it's not a matter of the less said the better exactly, but the less that's said by centrally by the government, and not at all, I don't mean by President Higgins, but by the government, in a sense, to try to claim back a fourth green field or anything like that, the better.
You yourself have said that the British saw this really as a second order problem, but then it came bang on their plate in 1969, and then, of course, recently under Brexit, it's a different contour again. Lloyd George would surely be surprised to think that the bargain he made, the fix that he managed to deliver in 1920 is still centre stage.
Oh, absolutely, he will be. And we forget first General Smuts, who had been a rebel in South Africa, and the Boers, who got terribly treated during the Boer War, suddenly get rehabilitated. They get de-othered, as it were, if there is such a term, or if I've just coined it. And but my argument is that from 21, from the British point of view, Ireland was a second order problem. And secondly, that Ireland was to a considerable extent incorporated into, we could call it the Imperial or the Commonwealth project, with considerable success. Even though she joins the League of Nations and so on, she actually uses the Commonwealth dominions a lot as allies in international discourse and in discourse with Britain. So I don't think you could say that independent Ireland was a sort of whether it was anti-imperial, it certainly wasn't anti-Commonwealth. And even, in 1949, there's evidence that Mr. De Valera was appalled, not just because he wasn't in government, at the declaration, after the Declaration of the Republic, because he would have liked to do that perhaps, but at leaving the Commonwealth, which he saw as very difficult, but he found it difficult to oppose in public.
Indeed, yeah. John Horn, what do you make of the whole question now of partition itself in terms of how Brexit has impacted on it and how it has come to the surprise, presumably, of the British cabinet that this border, which they didn't know where it was pretty well, and it wasn't in the Brexit debate at all when the issue was being, but now it's now in contention, as it were, again.
I know it is extraordinary, and I think at the time during the referendum campaign, the only people in Britain who were really speaking out in a warning way were Tony Blair and John Major, who of course had been instrumental in the Belfast peace agreement, saying that this will be called into jeopardy. But I think it was simply off the screen, even though the warnings were there, and now of course it's absolutely centre stage. In a curious way, though, I think it's a logical and ironic result of Brexit, because Brexit was the opposition to the European Union, and then it was really a failure to see the role that the European Union had played, that the single market had played, in effect, reducing this border to nothing once the military conflict was over in 1998. And so I think it has indeed caught them completely by surprise. And what it's thrown back absolutely to the centre, it seems to me, therefore, is the nature of the Union itself, because coming in tandem with the challenge from Scotland, it seems to me 100 years on, we are back actually to something which Alvin alluded to, and which was the way the Liberal Party in particular at the turn of the 20th century thought of a kind of devolved union, that Irish Home Rule might be accompanied by Welsh Home Rule, by Scottish Home Rule, and that we therefore at the moment have a kind of disintegration of the Union, the United Kingdom Union, which is raised through what's been crystallised by the issue of the border in the north.
Again, it's an unintended consequence, isn't it?
It is, absolutely. But can I just come in, just a quick remark? I was fascinated on the question of partition when it happened and commemoration now, because we have talked about the commemorative aspect in a north-south connection. And I just wanted to ask Marie, I was fascinated by what you said about, was it the Clonfin incident in County Longford, and the way in which local people there had gone to Britain to seek out the tombs or the traces of the auxiliaries. And coming back to President Higgins' point about the violence in the War of Independence, I wonder whether you think that there is any space at the moment for some east-west exploration of that. It seems to me that the commemoration of Balbriggan, the burning of Cork, that the British were simply absent. But is this an opportunity to try to engage in some sort of commemorative activity, which I think in the Republic, for us, would have the effect of trying to enable us better to understand and demythologize the black and tans, for example? Do you think that there's any possibility of that, or do you think that it's something which, again, as Ewan was perhaps suggesting, in some regards, the authorities would prefer to let sleeping dogs lie?
I think there's two aspects there. The first one you're referring to there is the initiative undertaken by Maeve Brady herself. And I think what that reflects, and it's something that Mary Daly has spoken about, her expertise looking at how 1916 was commemorated, is the importance of the initiative coming from below and not being imposed from above. So giving local communities the power to, or facilitating them to set the agenda for commemoration, I think it comes across well there. My honest view with the British side of it, the East-West side, is that there is just a lack of understanding in Britain of what happened in Ireland in 1921. In 2016, most British people seem to have woken up on the 24th of June and realised they had a land border with the European Union nation state. Most people in Great Britain do not seem to even recall the fact that the Union was changed in 1921 and that Britain lost a quarter of its landmass. So maybe there's a room there for greater engagement and trying to encourage greater British engagement with the Irish experience, but I just don't think there's enough of an understanding in Britain itself of what happened in Ireland to go as far as what we're suggesting.
Would you agree with that, Alvin?
Very, very strongly so. I think Mary is absolutely correct in terms of the lack of knowledge of the events in Ireland of the early 1920s. an ignorance which has unfortunately resonated, I think, through the decades. I recall researching a book a number of years ago, working in the British National Archives at Kew. I recall a letter, I think, from Edward Heath, then British Prime Minister, referring to what he described as the British High Commissioner in Dublin. So this was the British Prime Minister referring to the embassy of his own country as a high commission. And that, I think, though merely one instance, reflects, I think, some wider issues. There's a tremendous self-satisfaction, I think, within Britain, if I may say so, about historically speaking, this is about the robustness as well as the flexibility of the British Constitution. And I think we've alluded to this earlier on. So 1921 is seen as not in the terms that Mary has quite reasonably described it, but rather as a great victory for the flexibility of that constitution, and yet further testimony to the ability of the United Kingdom and the British Empire to bring on board former enemies, whether they be South African Boers, as Ewan has said, or indeed delving further into the 19th century, insurgent Quebecois within the Canadian context. So the Canadian constitutions of 1840 and 1867 are seen again as triumphs of imperial statesmanship, just as 1921 is.
But isn't it also the case that, listening to all of your contributions today and Professor Horn, that in some senses each of these major points in our history is best thought of as bespoke and as unique, that sometimes it's not, I mean, partition itself, if one compares the scale of the issue, say, between Ireland and the Indian subcontinent, the scale is so different, the details and the circumstances are so different that they're hard to compare. Alvin?
I entirely take the point, and as historians, we fret about these methodological issues, such as the nature of historical comparison. But while I entirely accept that there are differences in scale, looking at Ireland and India, or in other comparative cases, there may be as many distinctions and differences as points of comparison. At the end of the day, many contemporaries made these interlinkages, and the fact of the matter is that the Irish partition had an influence of sorts in terms of British imperial policy within India. And, the creator of modern Pakistan, Jinnah, for example, was interested in the Irish partition and interested in the arguments over the partition of Ireland and interested in Carson in terms of the politics of what was then Britain's Indian Empire and looking ahead to the possibility of a Muslim state.
Yeah, but Carson himself, for instance, was a disappointed man in his later years because he got what he didn't want.
Oh, Carson, absolutely so. Carson did not want the 1921 treaty. He didn't actually much want the 1920 Government of Ireland Act, though he went along with it. Carson, in his later years, embraced a full-blooded conservative imperialism, which involved him taking very unprogressive stands on, for example, Indian self-rule in the 1930s. But in terms of Ireland, Carson was fundamentally about an integrationist unionism. It should be said, I think, as well, that to get back to one of the earlier points you were raising, John, he was also interested in the possibility of federalism across the islands of Ireland and Britain. So he saw that as a way of sustaining some form of modified union relationship. That is to say, Ireland would have a form of self-government, but so too would Scotland and Wales. And that would be the new nature of union, and he was prepared to buy into that.
Ewan, did I see you attempting to come in there? Ewan O'Halloran.
Sorry, John. No, I was just saying that Jinnah himself the analogy is very interesting with Carson, and in some ways, like Carson, Jinnah in the end ended up with a state. In fact, a state bizarrely in two parts, separated by 1,000 miles, with which in a sense, he wasn't really. What Jinnah had been looking for was to defend Muslim interests, either in an India that remained in a kind of home rule, or in an India where politics would be the constitution would be so organized that Muslim interests would be protected. And if you look now at how Pakistan is treated in India in terms of othering, as treated with absolute contempt and referred to with absolute contempt in popular politics, and if you look at how Muslims are, where the Hindu narrative in India is now about Mughal oppression, the Mughals being the Muslim rulers and conquerors of much of what we now think of as iconic India, the creators of the Taj Mahal and so on. And Indian nationalists, historians and politicians are busy trying to write the Muslims, either to blame them and or to write them out of India's sort of pre-British colonial history.
Well, one man's partition is another man's liberation, of course. So President Higgins, can I ask you about this othering point? Are you optimistic that we can go through this decade of centenaries with this more constructive approach that you're hoping for? Or isn't there a lot of room for pessimism as well, that people see the history they want to see and they find that it's further embedded by the experience?
I think that there are a couple of things. I very much agree that there's great significance in the movements from below, about people who in fact actually want to repeople these periods themselves. Because, for example, I quoted the case of Eileen Quinn. Eileen Quinn's grandson has been to see the relatives of the RIC men in Roscommon, whose death had in fact led to the movement out from Gort towards Lady Gregory's estate, where that shooting took place. These are all very, very important. And I think it illustrates something else as well, that where there is need for care, and that is, what if we were in fact actually seeking to recover lost opportunities and missing opportunities, rather than in fact investing events? If you decide to load the symbolism on a particular selected event, there is a risk involved. There are opportunities in the way you do it. I think, for example, the speech of King George, for example, you could see positives in that very much. But also, I think there is a great case for the recovery of the better moments lost. For example, when I was looking at Geoffrey Lewis's Carson, book on Carson, Carson's speech to the Ulster Unionist Coulson in Belfast on the 4th of February 1921, where he says, "You will be a parliament for the whole community. We used to say that we could not trust an Irish Parliament in Dublin to do justice to the Protestant minority. Let us take care that that reproach can no longer be made against your Parliament, and from the outset let them see that the Catholic minority have nothing to fear from a Protestant majority." And there's great scope, in my view, of going back to that discourse which you have heard about the treatment of minorities. Because those who, for example, speak of a union, of what union? But then equally those who are speaking of United Ireland, of what kind of United Ireland and so forth. If the discourse can move to the point where we are, after all, in entirely new circumstances, but it is actually wrong to say that what we have experienced to be in terms of partition and the consequences of partition was delivered as a neat, finished package. There were those who from the very beginning retained hope, for example, that it would be temporary, which I think you could argue from some of the aspects of the King George V speech. You could also argue in relation to Carson's speech in many cases. We've already heard about it.
Intended to be temporary, but of course it became embedded and,
it did.
And fashioned the two states within Ireland,
yes, and
north and south.
That raises the question, for example, in relation to, I have said it elsewhere, if you put yourself north of the border as it is now, whatever like that, and you were seeing, if you like, a new state emerging. There was a need for an expression of a fundamental commitment to issues of conscience. Now, I don't say that in a very critical way, because after all, Irish nationalism had taken on a particular coloration from the Catholic emancipation on through the land war, and we will have a further seminar dealing with the impact of land and all of this, and that when we're looking at the land issue, you'll see huge points of commonality between the issues in Ulster and other parts of Ireland. And that's what I think here. You asked the question about said I don't represent the state, I represent the president running seminars, but it is very, very important. I do wish very much that everyone would participate with the advisory committee. That's so important. It would be very, very, very helpful, because it indicates a mind towards which, if you are preparing for the future, you must say, well, we don't intend to lock ourselves into the lost opportunities. I could have equally in the first seminar, speaking about, for example, the 1918 election, a point made in today's paper that a substructure of a state came into existence through the Sinn Féin courts and the gathering of taxes and all of this and the rest of it. You might say that was a great error too, not be able to respond, to recognise that irrespective of what had happened in 1916, the response to it, and then the further increases that took place, the conscription issue in 18, that at the same time there was this impetus that had been there for people to run a state in an orderly way. It's easy to say now that going back, if we could put, that one could have responded differently, saved a great deal of lives and tension. But that's no reason for saying why, for example, in envisaging the future, that you must get to points of original thinking rather than and that's the danger. What one has to be careful about, the symbolisms. The idea that you would, for example, symbolize something that was presented as a process, but you're going to recall it and commemorate it as a finished event. That's foolish in my view, but equally it is equally foolish to say that to those who rejected that, in fact, were in fact a form of martyrdom which is the exact same as everything else since. That's equally fallacious in my view. So that's why I'm hoping to call on my 6 seminars, and they will be all together, to see it as process. See it as process, very, very much so. And very much I'm open. I have been also as well, I have been contacted about there are ways we can cooperate on all of this and down through the levels, because one of the things that is in both, but it's missing in the book, we have I think that the 4th seminar is on social class. And that is perhaps the most important of all. For example, in relation to the pogroms which were mentioned, I mentioned in my paper that it wasn't only. What about the trade unionists who and the Protestant workers who were equally excluded from the shipyards? And what about particularly where everyone is using the phrase Bolshevism and so forth? While there are many people who are entirely critical of what has happened to socialism and communism, and by what happened much later on. This ease with which you can dismiss the dissenting intelligence about matters economic and social as Bolshevist, that was quite common north and south. And the brave people, when I look back on my visits to Northern Ireland many decades ago, was the great achievement of the trade union movement.
And John Horn, we've heard of the 1918 and conscription and how important that was, and Ewan mentioned that, but the 1918 election, of course, was a profoundly important use of as a revolution. It brought an amazingly important signal to the world and to London that the Westminster election was being used to measure the degree of Irish self-determination.
I mean, exactly that, and I mentioned the kind of twin track approach, if you like, a political movement and a military movement. And what I find fascinating and impressive is the way in which electoral politics were used throughout, were stitched throughout the War of Independence, as Eunan has referred to, but also how, in terms of the gunman and the use of violence, that even within the revolutionary movement, there was that whole question of civil-military relations, of who was actually in control. Was it Mulcahy? Was it the Doyle ministries? Was it the locals? And was it the local Sinn Féin clubs? Was it the local volunteers? There's a complexity there. And what I'm saying is that I think the way in which that issue itself within the independence and revolutionary process was dealt with, not just as a question of the constitutionalists versus Sinn Féin, helps explain the stability and the permanence of democracy in the new state in the South. President Higgins in his address talked, and I agree absolutely that if empire is diversity and hierarchy, that one of the things empires also need is ideologies, and ideologies which explain those hierarchies and which use them and manipulate them. But it does seem to me it's a dialectical process, and certainly in the Irish case, the degree to which British parliamentarianism and the assumptions of parliamentary government are there within Sinn Féin itself and within that process that we're talking about.
And for that, they were indebted to the Irish Parliamentary Party and their achievement, and to Parnell and to so many others.
And then we're back to the point of John Bruton's observations about the continued influence of that IPP legacy within Ireland.
They were tenant farmers. There's nothing more conservative than a man with 30 acres. And if he got it from the Irish Parliamentary Party, then that was embedded also as part of the Irish political culture.
And when we come to it, you'll also see the significant distinction between the grazier class and the different layers of landholding beneath them. I think, in a curious way, the historiography has found dealing with social class to be one of its most significant omissions. While very welcome to hear the case for people pushing their experience.
I should also add that there were 2 landslides in 1918, because in those 6 counties that became Northern Ireland, there were 22 Unionists, probably
yes.
Irish Unionists,
and
3 Sinn Féin and 4
and the constitutional nationalists, who were much stronger in the north than they were in the south. But can I just add to the President's observation that I think that as well as the democratic element and parliamentary element, which is stitched through the revolutionary process, we also have the labour movement and what I would call that process of civic protest.
Yes.
The trade unions, for example, not just the strike against conscription in 1918, but of course the ongoing railway strike in 1920. The way in which the Irish Transport and General Workers Union reaches its maximum strength at this stage and in the countryside, because it's recruiting the agricultural labourers who are brought into the fold. And even though at a political level we know that Labour stands back and Labour waits, it seems to be in a social way during the War of Independence, Labour is absolutely one of the participants in that.
I want to go back to our historians who are remotely joining us on one big issue, and many of you have mentioned it: ordinary lives. Too often ignored. Just in the nature of things, commemorations tend to be about big events. Big events are very often spectacular and violent events and great moments. But there's also ordinary lives don't have that moment, if you like, and therefore are not often commemorated. Marie, what's your opinion on all of this, and how can it be redressed?
I think the ordinary life is what interests people and what it's the hook to get them interested in the wider subject. I'm thinking of Richard Grayson's work on military history from the street, looking at particularly at the nationalists from parts of West Belfast who joined the British Army during the First World War, but also his way of encouraging people to take an ancestor who fought in the war and to start with the name on the war memorial and to take it from there and maybe find the obituary in the newspaper and work through these sources that way. But the ordinary life is the one that interests most people, because we all have an ancestor of some sort. My grandparents got married in November 1921, so I wonder what they must have thought of the way in which the country in which they lived was about to change. And it's the in. That's what grabs us. I think if we can look at the ordinary lives, the people we knew, our own ancestors, and take their story, that's the in into understanding the wider picture for many people.
Niamh Gallagher, you mentioned this as well, that there were too many ordinary lives not being celebrated. Celebrate is not the word I'm looking up for, commemorate, in the way we're approaching the centenaries.
Yes, so I think historians tend to be very interested, particularly when it comes to political histories, with, as you mentioned, John, the big histories, big events, parliamentary activities, constitutional questions, which are heavily male questions as well at the time. We must recognise that fact. Ordinary histories, I agree with Marie, can be a way into thinking more generally about these big questions, but they can also subvert or challenge these big things as well. So by looking at the agency of what people do, what their attitudes are, what their experiences were, we can actually start to unpick and untangle some of these big concepts. And I think with empire, this is a really good case study of how that can be done. We spent a lot of time talking today, understandably so, about violence, about imperial forms of repression, all of the really horrible stuff of empire that affected so many people across the globe. But Ireland has multiple narratives of its engagement with empire. One huge one was settlement. And, Ireland itself, we all know this, was a country of emigration. And between 1801 and 1921, something like 10 million people left the island. And they went to, as I said in my talk, parts of the empire where they settled, where they retained their Irish identities, which those identities themselves were fairly malleable. And actually, if you look at what an Irish American describes as Irishness today, or an Irish Australian, you might find that they're quite different. But the fundamental interesting point is that they retained some notion of Irishness, which they saw was capacious enough to link them to these different communities. So I think basically untangling these concepts where we look at ordinary people and what they do and what they did can really yield us to opening up to richer histories, really.
Yeah. Ewan, on that point?
Well, on the same point, President Higgins I mentioned creameries, and I'm glad he did, because when I was young, I read about creameries. I paid no heed to it because I was interested in ambushes and things. And we need to look at through the lives of the wider community what actually happened at the War of Independence. And it's not just about ambushes and killing; it's about places that appear to be quiet counties. For example, County Laois, where 2 out of 11 deaths are drunken policemen carrying out robberies at night, and so on. And so the terror is felt, and the memory of the terror. And we're often accused, I think, in this state of overstating the nature of the War of Independence as compared with how the British dealt with, and the Irish perhaps in British colours dealt with some trouble in India and elsewhere, like at Amritsar. But the memory, the cultural memory, the practical, if I just briefly say, my County Down grandmother, I asked her in the 1970s what it was like in the War of Independence in County Down, because her house was raided a lot because her brother was a Republican. And she told me a joke song about a terrible girl called Dora who came along and broke all the plates. So she told me a joke. I only learned recently she told her daughter about a feeling, she was 15 and 16, of sexual menace, because she was being held up not just by soldiers, but by young specials whom she knew, because she met them on the road every day. And they were women in the house because the men cleared out for fear of being arrested. And so there's different memories and so on at the ordinary proletarian level, if you like, and the more of them I think we understand, the more we'll have a greater understanding of the depths of feeling and the resilience of feeling and of memory right across the different communities in Ireland. Thank you.
Alvin Jackson, you're nodding to that, yeah.
Just in addition to all of this, I'd say that we, and in terms of the individual and the local and the personal, I think we really should be celebrating the digitization revolution of the past 20 years and the whole array of very individual and local materials that have been made available. The census records, Ewan has mentioned, I think in passing, for 1901 and 1911 made available through the National Archives in Dublin. Absolutely wonderful, and in many ways a wonderfully subversive resource. But at the personal and familial level, I know, through having trawled my own family's records through it, that the kind of the accepted narrative of my own family history just isn't borne out in terms of the documentation. And a wonderfully stimulating set of revelations through that material. But there's so much else besides the National Archives in Dublin's digitization of the some First World War records, the wills left by First World War soldiers. Again, very at one level very scrappy, very truncated, but my goodness, emotionally charged and wonderfully poignant records of these young soldiers who, for the most part, didn't return from the Western Front.
And accessing that sort of material and it being digitally available to the entire population turns those people into sort of historians, doesn't it? Rather than reading your books. Yeah. I mean, they can follow on
absolutely
to read the books, but it gives them that texture and that sense of finding something, discovery.
Absolutely so.
Yeah. Just on this general the ordinary people in the John Horne, in the records and in the commemoration, are you optimistic that we can get that in and that we can do this, as it were, the bottom-up approach?
My first answer is yes, when I look at what happened both north and south, I think, in relation to 2016, and particularly the area which Niamh is an expert in, the First World War, the experiences of the First World War. I'm really struck by the amount of family history interest. This democratization of the archive that we've been talking about, I think, was absolutely crucial in allowing people to become interested in their own family and community stories. And I think that that was very positive. But, and Ewan has made this point, I think in a way we were pushing at an open door. Because if we were talking about bringing back into the picture let's call it generally, the Catholic nationalist soldier, every side could agree. I mean, it was win-win. And I think that, as we've always recognized, the most difficult period of the decade of centenaries was going to be these few years. And in that sense, I'm less optimistic. I mean, I hope it will happen, but that was why I raised the question about, British ignorance, because it is a triangular relationship. It's not just north-south. And I think that also one comes across then the more ideological and narratives which both north and south we've had, and the importance of unpicking those. The question again, I think Niamh raised it, of the ways in which complex experiences at the time became subsequently simplified in people's own memories because of what they'd learned at primary school, north and south, because of simplified family narratives, which then, as it were, fitted the established heroic mythifications of history. So actually unpicking those things and finding the framework, finding the space in which one can do that and can allow these more complex issues to emerge, I think is not easy.
I think there's a huge issue, John, in relation to literature as well, restoring Sean O'Casey's insights to their proper place in the entire canon of it all. It's fascinating that O'Casey has, in fact, all of what we've been discussing, the people who came back maimed from World War I, the different views that people held in relation towards the people who had got fragments of Marxism and so forth. It's all in O'Casey, but it tells you something, to my mind, about how O'Casey has not been given the attention on the island of Ireland that he has got, for example, in relation to the United States, where people were studying the literature of the period, and it's of enormous significance, because you could get locked into the idea of an order lost and great chaos created. But there's an indulgence in that, to my mind, as a literary bias, that I very strongly think that the great tragedies and the great plays that O'Casey wrote are of immense importance. And, for example, why the rejection even of the silver tassie, they tell us an enormous amount about what were, if you like, in a way, middle-class excluding attitudes in relation to just about everything in terms of experience. The same thing is true in relation to the histories of sexual experience in literature, and that which was attributed, as it were, to the dangerous lower classes, and particularly women. So there's a great deal to go forward on if we were able to bring all these themes from below and gender in, I think.
Well, we leave that there, and my thanks to, all our thanks indeed, to Professor John Horn and to our contributing historians from Edinburgh and Dublin and Cambridge and Belfast. Thank you all, and thanks to the President for the initiative, indeed.